Kia ora and welcome to this interview for the Religious Diversity Center Aotearoa. My name is Beate Mattis and I'm part of the team at the Religious Diversity Center. We are a national center for educational research excellence dedicated to fostering appreciation and understanding of religious diversity among all New Zealanders. I'm pleased to have a special guest today with me in this interview. It's Rod Oram. Kia ora and welcome, Rod.
Ata Maria Beata.
Rod Oram is a New Zealand journalist and Newsroom weekly columnist. Rod is an active member of the Religious Diversity Center Climate Action Group, and he has attended climate change conferences for COP26 in Glasgow 2 years ago and COP27 in Egypt last year. We interviewed him then, and these interviews and discussions are still available on our website at www.rdc.org.nz. Currently, Rod is in Dubai attending COP28, and this conference started on the 30th of November and is going to finish on the 12th of December. Rod, you have now a lot of experience with the climate change conferences, and you've been following these UN climate change conferences for a decade or so. What would you consider as the highlights for this year's conference, which is still ongoing, but so far, what do you think are your highlights?
There is a far greater sense of commitment and, of course, what comes with that anxiety about climate. So, for example, it's remarkable that there is intense debate going on here about the language around fossil fuels. And yet it was only in Glasgow 2 years ago that fossil fuels got on into the final agreement for the first time. And that was in a very minor way about the phasing down of coal. Last year in Egypt, there was a large group of countries of some 80 that were trying to get a fossil fuel phase out into the final agreement, and they didn't succeed. But this year, there is definitely going to be language on fossil fuels, but with 3 days of negotiations still to go, and it will probably run beyond Tuesday for a day or two, there will definitely be language there. But the range of language on the table runs from a hard-out phase out of fossil fuels. There won't be any timeline in there, but it's very explicit, and it's all fossil fuels. And some of the more ameliorating language is, for example, coming from the Chinese, who are suggesting a word such as renewables substituting for fossil fuels. Well, that's already going on around the world, but that's not the point. The point is to send a very clear economic, political signals, very powerful ones, that we have to drastically reduce emissions from fossil fuels, and therefore we have to be phasing them out. That's exactly what the science tells us, and time is very, very short. And so that's the incredibly fraught, tense way these negotiations are coming to a great climax.
And when you talk about the fossil fuels, which countries are them heard about who is really pushing towards some changes in this area?
It's really interesting that on the positive side, you can name at least two very major producers, the United States #1 and Canada 4, who are very committed to language on this. The US is slightly harder to discern on this because John Kerry, the US climate envoy, tends to disappear from time to time down the black hole of carbon capture and storage, and talk about, well, are we talking about emissions here which are unabated, i.e. we can't capture them in any way, we can't capture them and store them, or are we talking about abated? And that sounds like a technicality, but it's a very crucial one because the technology doesn't exist to do abated, i.e. captured emissions at scale economically. And so he tends to get sidetracked by that. Canada is a bit more explicit, but that's at the federal government level. Of course, it's the federal government that's negotiating here, whereas you get state governments, or rather province governments, I should say, in Canada, obviously Alberta as the very large fossil fuel producer, which adamantly opposed to all this. Then at the other end of the scale, the Saudi Arabia is the largest of the Middle East oil producers, second to, actually these days quite a bit behind the United States. And it is absolutely adamant that there should be no language like this at all. And in fact, the energy minister of Saudi Arabia, on behalf of OPEC, the oil producers organization, a leaked letter from him the other day to the members are saying that we've got to come together to really, this is my language, not his, push back on these efforts. And then very particular interesting countries that are holdouts include Turkey, which is an interesting one, not that major a producer. But Turkey is a great player of the political game. So, for example, it's saying on Ukraine, yeah, we'll support Sweden coming into NATO, but the United States, we want to buy F-16 fighters from you, the most sophisticated fighter aircraft in the world. And you can well imagine Turkey saying no, no, no to anything on fossil fuels. But if you sell us F-16 fighters, then we'll change our mind. And then there are obviously very intransigent countries also, like Iran and Iraq.
Rod, this year also the number of participants was huge, and there was a sizable contingent of New Zealand participants. How did the previous government facilitate this?
There is a slightly arcane system with accreditation with the badges here. Of course, if you're a government and you're civil servants, you are the official delegation, the party, because a country is a party to the United Nations Convention on Climate Change, UN Framework Convention, UNFCCC. And so in past years, the official New Zealand delegation has been almost exclusively civil servants and politicians. But the mechanism is called party overflow. So these are civil society members who are included in the delegation. And this was the first time that our government, and this was initiated by the Labour-led one before the election, availed itself of the party overflow mechanism. And so there is a very considerable contingent of NGO, business, other civil society delegates in the official delegation. But in addition to that, there are lots of people who come here under their own steam. Sorry, steam is an unfortunate word in a fossil fuel context, under their own renewable energy. And they get their badges through other channels like media or their own NGO or whatever. A really important point that the government, every government's very sensitive about, those people who are here on the party overflow badge are paying all their own expenses. This isn't, a nice taxpayer-funded, excursion of some kind. And so the governments tend to be quite sensitive about that. So it's really hard to get a reasonably accurate account of how many Kiwis are here, but I'm very comfortable saying at least a couple of hundred. There's a very active WhatsApp message group here, Kiwis at COP, and we're getting towards 100 people in that. The bottom line is there are far more New Zealanders here than in the past. But other delegations are very huge too, far, far bigger. So the official count so far is more than 100,000 people. And some have already gone. They've come to do some meetings and business early on and have disappeared. But 100,000 is 2.5 times the size of COP27 last year, even slightly bigger than that, even than Glasgow the year before. But this has been an amazing surge in the number of delegates in the last few years, starting at Glasgow. That is absolutely testament to the rising levels of anxiety and determination around, responding more effectively to climate and the escalating climate crisis. The question then becomes, is it possible to have 100,000 people here at one event? And I say, well, you have soccer games in large stadiums around 1,000 people. It all depends how you organize them. And they are well organized here. They are good facilities. There are plenty of opportunities for people to get together. And crucially, the central negotiating space is very accommodating. It's very plush circumstances in the Dubai Exhibition Centre. Country delegation offices are not that far away. It's not much further to walk to meetings than it was, say, in Sharm el-Sheikh last year or Glasgow the year before.
So we were talking about the attitude of some countries towards fossil fuels. When it comes to New Zealand, who would have been the person who could give an opinion from the New Zealand government, or is that the delegation, the official delegation of a number of people? How does that work?
Ultimately, it's the head of delegation, which is our climate change minister, Simon Watts. We're slightly unusual. As a country, we have a separate climate change minister. A majority of countries, that role comes within the Ministry for the Environment. But anyway, we have Simon Watts. So he is the spokesperson for the government. He's only been here a few days, which is appropriate because the first week of COP is officials from governments working on the agenda, trying to develop draft language around issues, deciding collectively what issues to put on the agenda. And then the second week, which started on Friday, is when the political negotiations start. So he came in time for those. So he's the official spokesman, held, for example, yesterday, a meeting to which all New Zealanders here are invited. But he was calling it to hear what they were saying about COP and what they were learning, what they were thinking. And he stressed it was a listening experience rather than much of a speaking one for him. And that's how that played out. So when it comes to questions about what's the impact on New Zealand's reputation for this government's plans to reverse the ban on fossil fuel exploration offshore, he hasn't said much about that yet. He will no doubt say some more. He's the spokesperson on behalf of the government.
And when you say that there were some other people who could have paid their own fare, were there also some of the politicians from the old government who participated, just to
Yes.
for their interest?
Yeah, no, very importantly, James Shaw, our previous climate minister under the Labour-led government, is here in the role of an opposition politician, around and about having a wide range of meetings, I gather from talking to him. But crucially, Shaw is an old hand at these negotiations, and they are very complicated. So when Watts is seeking a bit of guidance, and he's obviously getting a lot from the officials in the delegation, who are also very old hands, Shaw's here also to be at a bit of an assistant on those arcane issues of how COP works and how best to navigate through them. And I think that's great, because it's really important for all of us to share our experiences here, and regardless of quite where we stand on issues, because humanity has to respond collectively. So the least we can do as a small subset of humanity is us New Zealanders to show a little bit of collaboration and comradeship in all this.
And you talked about humanity now. I understand that there's also something called a faith pavilion at this year's climate change conference. Have you been there?
Yes,
Can you tell us more about it?
I have. Yeah, not so called. It is the Faith Pavilion. It's at a really interesting, literally, crossroad in the enormous campus here. And that's part of the Expo 2020, which is a global, I think it's every 3 or 5 year jamboree of nations. And so a lot of the physical infrastructure for Expo 2020 has been kept to be used for COP28. And indeed, it's meant to be a permanent exhibition space. And it's a really interesting, and so there's this sweeping arc of a central thoroughfare through all this. And then there's a major intersection coming up to it, to that. And the Faith Pavilion sits right at that crossroads. It's quite fascinating. It's also a very striking building because, well, a lot of the other buildings here are very blocky. They just look like literally office buildings, sort of 3 stories high and rectangular. It has this sweeping pointed lines reaching up to the heavens, I guess. And so it's striking. It's a striking building. It's inside. There's a good meeting space and a little bit of room for side conversations. There's a kitchen. I think there's an office upstairs. So it's got all the amenities you need. And it really is a place where all the faiths of the world are playing a role. There is a very strong interfaith, and indeed within Christians, a strong ecumenical drive to all of this. And I've been enjoying some time with fellow Anglicans from the Worldwide Anglican Communion, for example. I haven't had a chance to experience much in the Faith Pavilion yet. I'm afraid I've been pursuing very temporal things, running around COP. And my overall sense, and this is, I stress this is an impression, it's not a deep analysis of the program, is that the way the faiths of the world come at this is very strongly from a social justice perspective, and stressing how everybody needs to be brought along on this journey, and everybody have a chance to share equally in the rewards of responding to climate change, and not suffer a disproportionately heavy burden from not, as is happening now in developing countries. So I think the emphasis is quite a lot more on the social justice side than bringing any kind of spiritual or faith message very explicitly to this. And I see there's a certain logic in that, because if you're talking social justice, you are talking language that's being widely used, and yet these faiths are bringing a clear and distinctive message on that. So they are contributing in that way. Now, I say this as a Christian who has slowly come to this realization. And I remember the moment very explicitly. It was in October 2018 when the IPCC, the United Nations Climate Scientists body, brought out its first report on 1.5 degrees. I was talking about it on 9 to Noon with Catherine Ryan, and I was determined that I was going to say this particular point. Catherine was saying essentially, well, that's monumental. It's very difficult. What can we do about this? Will we be able to do anything about this? Again, I'm paraphrasing Catherine. And I said quite simply, I don't think we will do enough until we care enough. And I don't think we will care enough until we have some kind of spiritual relationship with the living earth, with creation. And you can express that in whatever way is most meaningful to you. It could literally be a walk in the woods or in the bush or along the beach, and just feel some sort of oneness, some kinship with nature. Or you could have strong, very, very spiritual relationship, which transcends, if you like, any organized religion. Or you could be very active in one of the great faiths of the world. So that's kind of how I feel about these things.
Rod, when you talk about the pavilion, I'm just wondering, do you feel like it's a building aside? It's like the bad conscience is sitting there, but you ignore it? Or are these faith-based communities really part of the whole event? Is it something where politicians would go to the pavilion and the faith-based community groups or delegations would have something to say? Can you tell us a little bit more about what the impact is?
It's definitely outreach rather than hospitality. Come on into our faith pavilion. It's very much outreach. It's representatives from these faiths finding ways to go and talk to politicians and to others. So you need to be out and about. And indeed, I'm not following the other faiths as closely as I'm following the Worldwide Anglican Communion. But judging by its message group, it's very active. Those Anglicans are very active. And of course, from a very wide range of countries out there seeking meetings with people, having a chance to contribute to it. So it as I say, outreach rather than hospitality.
Yeah, you say they do outreach, but how do they convey their message? By visiting the politicians, or do they have speeches during the sessions? How can I imagine that?
It's kind of all of that. There's a lot of statements are disseminated. There are a lot of declarations. There are a lot of proposals, broadcast in some way, and then there are plenty of side events, as everything's called outside the actual physical negotiations. There are side events that bring these people of faith together, or gives these people of faith a chance to talk with others. So there are very diverse ways for people to be engaged in this way. And I think the energy and the creativity of that, the determination to be a part of the conversation, contribute to that global conversation, is certainly a feature of the faith presence here.
And do you think that they are working well together, the different faith groups, or do you have the different faith groups reaching out separately and they are just combined under one pavilion?
There is there's a lot of occasions where there are multiple representatives from multiple faiths speaking together. And so, for example, there are press conferences where you will get a good representation. I can't give a more detailed feel of that because I'm not around all of those conversations and those events. But there is real multi-faith leadership on this. But like so many things here at COP, you get different people or different organizations coming together to do something specific. And then a different subset will go off and do something else. So it's kind of like this coming together and then splitting apart, and a different array of people converging to do something. So there's a wonderful dynamic in all this, and it's a very creative dynamic, I think.
Tell me, what is the overall hope now for the next COP, for the next years to come? Because you mentioned the fossil fuels, you mentioned the different faith groups who hopefully will have an impact and will leave some, in a way, seed for new plants, and to think about in a positive way, and for the caring, as you say, we need to care enough. And so what do you think will come out of this COP28 now?
The job will never be done. And it almost certainly will never be done fast enough or on large enough scale. So regardless of what's decided here, even if in the very best, and I would have to stress the chances of this are slim, a very clear agreement by the nations of the world that fossil fuels are going to be phased out, there is still an unbelievable amount of work still to do on that. So the work goes on. Almost, I think far more likely the language is going to be vaguer than that. And therefore, over the next year, the negotiations in the meantime, the escalating climate crisis will concentrate minds some more. And as we work towards COP29, which hasn't finally been decided who the hosts are, but it's most likely to be Azerbaijan, again, another petrostate, a rather small one with only a population of about 10 million people. Baku, its capital, is less than, I think it's about 3 million or so, 3.5 million. And so this will be a country that has neither the physical facilities nor the financial resources to stage a COP as comprehensive as this one. They will get lots of help from other countries, but the resources of the host
100,000 people is a lot for a town, for a city, a smaller city.
Well, that's actually the size of Dubai as an
Really?
emirate. Well, Dubai City.
Yeah.
But of course, this Dubai for many decades has been building itself up as a global business center, a global transportation center. 66 million people went through Dubai International Airport last year. 12 million people visited Dubai, came cityside from the airport last year. So Baku is obviously quite different. But crucially of all, most crucially of all, is that with all due respects to the Azerbaijanis, they do not have the diplomatic depth or experience that the UAE's got. And talking to one or two people who have been close to the preparations for COP28, they unprompted said how impressed they were by how well the UAE had acted as host and president, i.e. chair of COP, in preparation. In diplomatic terms, one person even rated them close to the British in preparations for Glasgow, which I thought was a really interesting comment, which says a couple of things. Simply, the UK had more time to prepare because Glasgow should have been 2020, but it was postponed a year because of COVID. But also British efficacy as diplomats is waning. Britain's role in the world is waning fast, and the UAE is on the rise, is what I would take from that. However, the point is, the UAE did prepare well for this in terms of the agenda, lots and lots of meetings with governments and others to try to create a comprehensive and constructive agenda here. And they put a huge resource into that in terms of people on the diplomatic front. And of course, no country hosts alone in that sense. They've got the UN behind them. They've got lots of friends and allies to help them. But still, should Azerbaijan be chosen, it would be a very huge task for them.
Well, if the UN supports the countries that are hosting the COP conferences, why is it not going to be, why are they not held in countries where you can really see the impact of climate change? And then they could go into show places and say, look, this is where the beach used to be and this is where it is now.
The simple explanation for that is the UN is organized around 6 geographic regions. And so the presidency of COP rotates through those 6 regions. It's the turn of Eastern Europe to host next year. Azerbaijan, though slightly east of the Bosphorus, is counted in Eastern Europe. But Russia has been vetoing, obviously in the Eastern European group, has been vetoing any country that has even suggested any opposition to its war in Ukraine, against Ukraine, or opposition to Russia in any other way. And so Russia's been vetoing every idea of anybody else. So that's why it comes down to Azerbaijan. Whilst it makes it a smaller country, makes it harder to host, I still think it's really important that these COPs do go to many different countries. So after Azerbaijan next year, it's already agreed that Brazil is hosting the year after. So that the people who come to COPs get to experience at close hand what's going on in those countries. And bearing in mind, last year it was Egypt. So I think delegates are exposed insofar as they manage to get outside the bubble of COP while they're here. They are exposed to that. Even if they don't get outside the bubble, the hosts find ways to make their case one way or another. So I think it's really important that there is this nomadic process, if you like, where, once every year, the UNFCCC pulls up its tent pegs and moves on somewhere else. Home base is Bonn in Germany for the UN Climate Convention framework. And there are some diplomats who argue very vociferously that COP should be pared back to just political negotiations, supported by civil servants, say maximum of 20,000 people. And more radically, they say it should just be in Bonn every year. That keeps things simple. Well, I think that's a disastrous mistake on two grounds. First of all, they would be in an echo chamber, devoid of any contact with civil society. And secondly, they would get to be very familiar with Bonn in winter, but that's not exposing them to the world at large and the climate crisis.
Rod, as we're coming to the end of this interview, do you have a message for the religious community, the religious diversity in Aotearoa, New Zealand, for the different faiths that are working together and to improve the situation regarding climate change?
Yes. We are one of the most immigrant-intensive countries in the world. If we look just at Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, around about 43 or 4% of us who call that place home came from abroad. I'm clearly one of them. And we are very diverse in that. But also, we people of faith are a decreasing minority of the population, and certainly within individual faiths within that we are. And so it's really important for us to come together, not just so that we have a bigger voice, but to show that people who do not necessarily align completely on issues are able to work together. You know, we each bring our own faith, our own theologies, our own practices to this, and yet we can speak together with one voice. And we bring that social justice message, and we bring, I hope, a sense of possibility, a sense that we can progress on all this. But crucially, we can show that we can work together as quite different New Zealanders in terms of our background, but united in a common cause, an existentially important common cause.
Thank you so much, Rod. And this has been really interesting to get to know a little bit more about what's happening now in Dubai in the climate change conference. And I just like to draw the attention to the work of the Climate Action Group. And as I said, Rod Oram is part of the Climate Action Group of the Religious Diversity Center. There are more resources, webinars, etc., video recordings on the website at www.rdc for Religious Diversity Center.org.nz. So thank you, Rod, and I wish you a good day in Dubai and a good final days for your conference. And thank you for coming for the interview.
Thank you, Beate.